Hello and welcome everyone to today's Brilliant Minds, Bold Questions virtual talk. Our series spotlights high-impact research from across the academy, from computer science, population and public health, to economics, and today, molecular microbiology. If you are not familiar with us, CIFAR is a global research organization that convenes extraordinary minds to address the most important questions facing science and humanity. My name is Kate Getty. I am Senior Director of Research at CIFAR, and it is my distinct pleasure to introduce you to our two speakers for today's talk on what actually killed the dinosaurs. First, we have Arturo Casadevall, who is a Bloomberg Distinguished Professor of Molecular Microbiology and Immunology and Infectious Diseases at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health and Johns Hopkins School of Medicine. His research focuses on host defense mechanisms, how fungi cause disease, and in the development of antibody-based therapies for infectious diseases. He is also the advisory committee chair of CIFAR's program on the fungal kingdom, threats and opportunities. Second, we have Rebecca Shapiro, a CIFAR Azrieli Global Scholar in the same Fungal Kingdom Threats and Opportunities program. Rebecca is assistant professor in the Department of Molecular and Cellular Biology at the University of Guelph, where she examines the biology and pathogenesis of certain fungal species. Today's session will last approximately 30 minutes. I will start with a question before inviting our speakers to ask one another questions for about 20 to 25 minutes. After this, I will open it up to questions from participants online. So if you're an online audience member and have a question, you can use the Q&A function to submit it. We do ask that you not use the chat function to submit questions. Lastly, this session is being recorded and will be available on the CIFAR website next week. So to get us started, most of us are brought up to believe that a meteor hit the Earth, leading to the extinction of the dinosaurs. But as this talk title suggests, it seems that it might not be quite so simple. What is missing from this widely held idea, and how do fungi fit in?
So, Kate, thank you for your question, and thank you for inviting me. I think the general explanation that a meteor did it is the right explanation. I mean, but there are nuances to this. The event is thought to have been a collision from something about 17 miles in length that hit the Yucatan 65 million years ago. And it would have caused a tremendous calamity in the Earth, massive tsunamis going through North America, rapid warming of the atmosphere, massive amount of dust, and then fires on the Earth. So anything at the top of the food chain would have been in trouble. Dinosaurs were at the top of the food chain. And probably, perhaps some survived. But the question is, what happened in the aftermath of the calamity? What happened in the month and the years after that? And what hopefully we'll talk about is a world dominated by the fungi. And anything that survives, anything that made it then, would have had to deal with a massive fungal bloom as the planet became a global compost.
So I think maybe jumping in on that, what then precisely were the sort of conditions of this post-meteor world, and how did they specifically favor fungal growth?
So there has been a lot of work reconstructing the calamity. You can imagine that the immediate blast would have led to rapid heating of the atmosphere. And then these shock waves would have basically went around the world. And two things will happen then. The tsunamis, the shock waves will have knocked down the trees. But what really hurts the plant life is large millions of tons of Earth are basically kicked into low orbit. And these now will obscure the sun, shutting down photosynthesis. Now, many of those rocks are in unstable orbits and will begin to come down. And they come down as flaming meteorites. So you have fires, you have the death of the vegetation, and you have rapid cooling. The Earth cools very rapidly after that. So you have dark, dead vegetation and cool, and those are the ideal conditions for a fungal bloom.
So where does then the link with dinosaur extinctions come in? So given the sort of conditions that are favored now in this really terrible sounding, apocalyptic world, why are fungi then favoring infection in dinosaurs at this stage then?
So what the way I look at it is that clearly things survive. We're here. So clearly our mammalian ancestors made it. Clearly our reptilians made it. We have reptiles today. We got iguanas. Insects made it. Dinosaurs didn't make it. But, dinosaurs were in all kinds of shape, from enormous to smaller ones. And one potential explanation for this is that certainly mammals with their internal combustion engines, they remain warm. The others, certainly the reptiles didn't. What happens when reptiles are cold? They can't move. They can't digest food. So these conditions would have given a huge advantage already to anything that was warm. And now you could add the fungal spores. So in this cataclysmic post-apocalyptic world, you would have had massive amounts of fungal spores. And you can always overcome an immune system with a sufficient inoculum. So for the cold-blooded animals, they would have been at a great disadvantage, not only nutritionally, not only moving around, but now having to deal with massive numbers of fungal spores. In the meantime, our small ancestors would have done well. They could move, they could eat mushrooms, they could eat all kinds of things, and they would establish much larger populations. So when the skies cleared and the earth begins to recover, now you have a lot more mammals than you have reptiles, large founder populations, and then you have the age of mammals.
And what do we have like concrete evidence from the fossil record for this? You talked about, huge blooms of spores in this time. Do we know that happened?
Yes, there is in the fossil record, what is known the KT boundary, that is the Cretaceous Tertiary boundary. There is evidence for massive fungal proliferation. Not only there, but if you go back in time, this happened 65 million years ago. If you go back to the Permian extinction, there the fungal layer in some parts of South Africa is as much as 1 meter. Think about that, 1 meter of fungal spores. So anything that survives, the fungi will always do well when things go bad for other organisms, okay? And they do very well because they tend to degrade matter, and they will survive in these environments. And when they survive, they produce large spores. And large amounts of spores means that you have to make it through this fungal bloom. So yes, there is fossil evidence for massive fungal proliferation in those two great calamities, the Permian and the KT boundary.
And so it seems like, temperature really then is the big player here, that, warm-blooded mammals sort of had the advantage here to protect themselves, against fungal infection. So how does that sort of play out, in the world today? And if we're thinking about, a world of changing climate and temperature, how will this potentially impact what we see with fungi today and susceptibility of different kinds of animals?
That's a great question, Rebecca. The way I came into this was because it always bothered me, the question, why mammals? I already had 3 meals today. If I was reptilian, I can probably do with 1 meal a week. How do we end up selecting large animals that have to eat all the time? That doesn't make any sense to me unless there was a selection mechanism. Something had to favor being hot, the way I think about it is that this temperature creates a thermal gradient between us and the outside. Now it turns out that we looked at a susceptibility of fungi to temperature. about 10 years ago. And most fungal species cannot tolerate 37 degrees. They simply stop growing. So just being 37 degrees is giving you a tremendous protection against the fungal kingdom, which is, by the way, the major pathogens of plants, a cold-blooded animal, insects, and many others. So guess what's happening in the world today? The world is getting warmer. So what is this going to do? Well, you have a lot of organisms out there that maybe the temperature max is 34, 35, 36 degrees. But they are loaded with the capacity to cause disease in other organisms. But they can't break through your temperature barrier. But what would happen if they adapted? Then, as a result of a warmer climate, then we can be facing new threats from that we don't even know yet, because they haven't been a problem up to now.
And so, and I guess, adding on to the kind of temperature question here, then where do other animals fit in? I think if my basic biology is correct, I think birds are even, warmer than us humans. So, are birds going to take over the world next? Is that going to be kind of our trajectory from here?
Well, it's interesting. I'm glad you bring in the birds. So the birds and the mammals are the two, and by the way, the crocodiles. I don't know what's going on with the crocodiles, but the birds, the mammals, and the crocodiles are the major groups that make it through do well after the KT calamity. The birds are already pretty high. The birds are quite resistant to fungal diseases, except for one kind of fungus type, which are already thermally adapted, and that's the Aspergillus. The Aspergillus family is often what you find in a compost. You drive by, you see a compost, you see smoke coming out. Those are fungi there carrying out metabolism. These are those fungi are already quite adapted. And for whatever reason, the birds are susceptible to Aspergillus, but they are pretty resistant to everything else. You can, for example, pigeons are associated with cryptococcosis, but you can't give a pigeon a cryptococcal infection because their temperature is 42, so they are able to do so. So the birds, why are the birds hot? Probably because flight requires a tremendous investment in energy, and the hotter the energy, the more efficient it is. So it turns out that in the case of birds and the case of the primitive mammals that were around, they were pre-adapted perhaps for different conditions.
Very interesting. And so maybe to kind of circle back to Kate's original question, then, how did this whole idea emerge? How did you how did this theory sort of come together, given what, we currently know about fungi, but of course, without being able to actually have a record of what would have happened during the time of the dinosaurs?
Well, I like to read outside my field. And I pride myself that every day I try to read something about outside my field. And the asteroid hypothesis came to be in the early 80s when an iridium level was found, and that's what gave the clue that it came from outer space in the KT boundary. But I always been bothered by the question, why mammals? Mm-hmm. Now people said, well, you had a calamity, and it created a space, and the mammals moved in because the dinosaurs were not there. That doesn't make any sense to me. You still have reptiles, you still have others. Why do you end up selecting something that needs so much food? You needed to have something at the end of the day that for which this temperature provided an advantage. Otherwise, we make no sense. And that's separate than the birds. The birds already had that advantage in the sense that they need it. They may have had it for flight, but for the terrestrial one of us, the creatures, and so that always bothered me. It never made any sense to me that people say, "Well, a space got created and the mammals took over." Now that you need to have something. And then what happened? Trying to read in other areas, I came to that article showing in 2003 of a fungal bloom around the KT boundary that was published. I believe it was in Science, and the two things began to fit in together: fungal bloom, thermal protection, mammalian dominance. So it's really a thought. This idea comes from linking in very different aspects of facts into new thought.
And is there anything that we can then, take from this and sort of apply? If we're thinking about how to protect either ourselves as humans or other animals against fungal infections, can we exploit this idea of temperature as being sort of protective? Or is there somewhere we can sort of take this and learn from this?
I think that, yes, I think that there's a lot to do here, but maybe first we can visit the bats. So it turns out that the bats in North America were doing pretty well up to 2006. In 2006, a fungus was introduced from Europe that is a cold-loving fungus. So it can only grow at cold temperatures, and began to kill the bats. It began in New York and in New York State, and it spread through the whole continent. And the bats are susceptible in the winter, not in the summer. Mm-hmm. So the bats, the reason is in the temperate climates, there is no food. So the bats hibernate. The fungus grows on them and essentially wakes them up in the middle of the winter because they're sick and they can't feed and they die. If you take those bats from the cave to the laboratory and feed them, just giving them food drives up their metabolic rate and they can clear the fungal disease. That's giving you a tremendous, powerful anecdote of the power of temperature. Another example are the frogs that are infected with the chytric fungus. If you bring them into a lab and you put them at 37 degrees, you can cure them of the chytric. So it is possible. So there are a couple of things you can think of. You can think of that for infectious diseases that are acquired from the environment, that we may be able to exploit temperature, that perhaps we shouldn't be giving everybody Tylenol when they have a severe fungal disease, that the temperature, increasing the temperature could make the fungus more susceptible to the internal environment. The other thing to think about is that temperature pathways may be targeted in drug development. We know very little about how do you adapt to higher temperatures. This is an area that, almost, let me give you a thought example. Almost everything we know in immunology is done at 37 degrees. Mm. But immunology in your skin happens at 31 degrees. Mm. You would think that there has to be a lot of more research looking at temperature as a variable in all aspects of microbial pathogenesis. But yes, I think that it is something that we currently don't target. So it is a target, to me, it's a target for exploration of possible opportunity.
Very cool. So sort of centering this around reptiles and the dinosaurs and the sort of advantage of mammals. But, to today, we know that certainly humans and other mammals are still, to a certain extent, susceptible to fungal disease. So is this just sort of the exception to the rule, or where does sort of human vulnerability to fungal infection then fit in?
So I think that the fungal diseases emerged in the 20th century as a major. We know tuberculosis from antiquity. We know a lot of diseases from a long time. But fungal diseases really began to take off in 1950. What happens in 1950? Corticosteroids are developed. Chemotherapy is developed. Then in the 1980s, you have the HIV epidemic. What do all these things have in common? They interfere with our immunity. So there are two pillars to our resistance. One pillar is immunity, advanced immunity, having T cells, B cells, innate immunity, you name it. And the other one is temperature. So what we saw in the 20th century was that if you mess around with the pillar of immunity, you get more fungal diseases. What we are afraid of to see in the 21st century is that the fungi may adapt and then defeat or mess with our second pillar. But I think it is a fact that immunologically competent mammals are remarkably resistant to fungal disease. They do occur, but they are very rare. And what we are learning now with genomic analysis is that when they occur, they often tend to be some sort of error. For example, a mutation in the dectin pathway or signaling or something like that, that sets it apart. So I would focus more on the remarkable resistance and try to understand that rather than the susceptibility, because I think the susceptibility that has many causes, and you can certainly, by the way, drugs, transplants, and things like that. To me, that's a very interesting scientific question.
Definitely. Yeah, I think in our current pandemic era, I think we all, I think everyone is very attuned to thinking about kind of human vulnerabilities and immunological kind of susceptibilities. So it's very interesting. It's certainly kind of an out there theory and is, different, I think, from, what we are used to thinking about, and not necessarily intuitive to kind of center this important event around these kind of fungal species and the impact that they've had. So has there been sort of pushback to this theory? Are there people who think otherwise?
It's one possibility is that nobody cares. Another possibility is that people say, well, it may be, but what I would say to you is that as a scientist, there are three big questions: what, how, and why. I mean, among the other big questions. So scientists are pretty good at what we describe stuff. Now, people like to work on mechanism. That's how you do it, but we tend to stay away from the why. The why often gets people very, worried. You get into metaphysics, you get into teleological reasoning, whatever. But I am interested in all three. And to me, the why questions, it really often explain a lot of the world as it is. So to me, a lot of this came from trying to understand the why question. Why mammals? To me, that's a really interesting issue. That needs an explanation, and whatever was out there was certainly not sufficient for me. And it's been a lot of fun. Look, this is something you can talk at a cocktail party. I can't talk about my other work at a cocktail party without having everybody leave.
Yeah. Maybe I'll just jump in to remind any of the audience members that if they have any questions, they should feel free to drop them into the Q&A section of the webinar. And while I have the microphone, I might take the opportunity to circle back to some of the questions around temperature and make a connection with climate change. Do we think that climate change may affect fungi? And if so, how? What about their ability to cause infection? Yeah.
So we have one example, again, it needs explanation. It falls into a why question. I pose it to you. Candida auris was unknown to medicine till 2007. You can't find it in any collection. You cannot. In 2010 and 2011, it emerges simultaneously in 3 continents. And they are not, the clades are different. So these are not that somebody took it and flew from one country to another. 3 continents. Why would that be? Why would you have this thing emerge at the same time? And then you may begin to look and say, what is happening in common on the 3 continents? And, we have proposed that this may be the first example of an organism adapting to higher temperature and breaking through the thermal barrier. Now, whether it's right or not, I don't know. It was just recovered in the Andaman Islands. It turns out that the wild isolate it was less temperature adapted than the ones that they recovered from a beach that could have been put there by humans. So what I would argue is that we need to focus. Why questions are fun. Why questions can drive all kinds of research. And they can also open the areas that we don't know that could also be addressed.
Good thing we have a program called Fungal Kingdom Threats and Opportunities.
Well, I'm glad you do.
Yeah. So I'll read another question that's come in from the audience. And they ask if you have any comments on how long the dinosaur extinction event would have taken. How abrupt was the fungal bloom? And how long would a fungal infection take to kill a dinosaur?
So I guess I began by saying I don't know. And then once you say, I don't know, I think we can say things like, well, there is evidence. People have found evidence that some may have survived the initial blast. It's really not clear whether they all died in around a few weeks of that horrible day 65 million years ago, or whether in some parts of Earth, some survived and then subsequently went extinct. I think the fungal bloom would have taken weeks to months to years. You need to have vegetation die, and we know what happens in the forest. It takes a while for things to begin to decay, but it's probably, we would be dealing with decades, if not hundreds of years, of massive numbers of fungal spores. And whatever survived had to deal with that.
Well, so a related question that has come in is asking whether when species became extinct might be directly linked to body temperature. So the question is related to the sauropods that have 37 degrees Celsius body temperature, which became the dominant species in the early Jurassic period.
Yes, so that, but people said to me, the way to preface that question is, how do there is some evidence, there is actually some evidence dinosaurs were warm-blooded. How does this fit? Well, notice what I'm saying. I'm saying that the great killing of this group of organisms was the calamity. There is, even though the idea of high temperatures in them may come from the fact that they are enormous masses, and just having all that cytoplasm metabolically will drive up the temperature. But I don't think we have any evidence that they regulated the temperature like we do, or that they would have been able to maintain those temperatures when in a situation of dropping global temperatures, lack of food. So I think that it's not a problem for this hypothesis, because the postulation is those large ones probably were at the top of the food chain, and that would have been in deep trouble in the calamity, whether they were right near it or on the other side of the Earth.
We're almost out of time, so maybe I'll close with one last question. But the question is, if fungi haven't traditionally co-evolved to be human pathogens, will increased tolerance to higher temperatures by climate change be enough to make them serious human pathogens?
So people often say, becoming a pathogen is a good thing. Where's the data for that? In fact, I would argue that most microbes pay a price in getting the capacity for virulence. What does it give you? Well, it gives you a new place to grow. And it may give you transportation. If you get into an animal, they can be moved around. But when we actually wrote an article about the cost of virulence. So when people say, well, why haven't the fungi adapted? Well, you know what? This may not necessarily be in their best interest, or there may be no selection pressure for it. But I think that if we get more, it will be by accident. You will basically end up raising the temperature, the thermal temperature at which they can grow, because they have to live in a warmer world. And some of them will be loaded with the characteristics that will allow it to cause disease. There is no intelligence behind this. There is just evolution and selection.
Well, thank you both so much for sort of a whirlwind tour and a fascinating talk on what is a fascinating hypothesis. So thank you so much to Arturo Casadevall and to Rebecca Shapiro for sharing your insights with us today. And thank you to all the audience members for joining in. We'll have a recording of this talk available on our website, CIFAR.ca, likely sometime early next week. So thank you all.
Thank you for having me. It's been a lot of fun. Science is a lot of fun.
That's right.
Thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you.